I want to start this video with, can you see the problem? I'm showing you all kinds of pictures. I'm going to show you all kinds of pictures from videos, from different YouTube videos on Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And I'll ask again, can you see the problem? Can you see the problem with all of these images that we just accept for normal? Because here I'm showing you images of three people. They're images, and they always have these three images of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, the three sons of Noah. And there's a couple pictures as well of their wives, but be that as it may. But the issue is there were 8 souls that came off the ark. And we see that there's a family, right? Yes, there were 3 wives married to the 3 sons, and there's Noah and his wife, 8 souls that came off the ark. And they are a family. So can we see the problem? Can we see the problem here? How did we get to where, instead of seeing a family, which is obvious from the tale in the Bible, how did we get from seeing a family to seeing races, 3 separate races? Where did that come from? You know, because if you've read the Bible, and I'm sure you have, you've come to the conclusion that, you know, anywhere in the Bible do you see race hardly mentioned at all. It's almost not mentioned at all. And yet here we have this image that we see over and over and over again for Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and it's always racially based. And so can we see the problem? Where did this come from? Where did we get this understanding that these 3 men who had one father and one mother, where do we see, or where do we get the idea that they were so different? So can we see the problem? And my channel, I call it Fleeing Babylon for a purpose, in a sense, because church and state combined are Babylon. At least that's what a lot of people think. I do agree with that. But the issue is, in order to flee Babylon, we have to see it. So who gave us this image of these 3 sons of Noah? You know, where did it come from? How did it get developed? Because it's not an image that comes even from the Roman days. It's an image that comes much, much later. We're going to get into that. For this video, I do, of course, want to cover for a second the Roman times and how they saw things, into the 1500s, the 1700s, the 1900s, and where do we get these images from? Where do they just start cropping up that we have these images that don't even, I'm sorry, but they don't, for me, when I saw it, it was like, you know, because I'm like you, I've seen these things over and over and over again, and you don't really pay attention. Once I started looking at it, I'm thinking about it, I'm going like, that's not even logical, right? It's not even logical. If we take any place in the world, if I took you to some pictures of Ethiopia or India or China, Japan, Mongolia, Russia, doesn't matter where you go, you would see 3 people born into a family, and they would all be different, yes, slightly, as we all are, unless we're identical twins, we're all slightly different, but yet we wouldn't see 3 races of people coming from 2 parents. I can't imagine going to a Chinese family. I can't imagine seeing one of their children being European, the other one being from Africa, and the other one being from the Middle East, or wherever we want to plot them. There's an issue here. How did we get to this idea that Noah and his sons all looked like they were from 3 different parts of the world? And I know logically it's like, oh yeah, maybe you're seeing it now, but for me, when I saw it, it was like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? So think about any place in the world where you have a family, even if you go to America or Europe or like Britain, where there has been a lot of different races moving in and out. So yes, there's not just one cohesive unit. But if I go to any American family or any Canadian family or Australian family or British family, and whether that British family originated in India, or they originated in Africa, or they originated in Britain itself, their sons, the 3 sons, if they had 3 sons, would look like the parents. They'd be of the same basic look as their parents, no matter where they were born. It's just logic, right? It's like logic. So in this video, I want to go, how did we get there? How did we get to this? And it's really quite later, and I will get into that. It's very interesting. But how did we get to where, if we read the Bible, and I'm going to show you that in a second here, but when we read the Bible, and the genealogy of Noah and his sons are all there, and the different tribes and peoples and nations that came from them. But if you think back to your Bible reading, you'll realize That's right. They may have even listed sometimes geography a little bit, but even that's not that much. Really what they list is family lineage, family lines, and nations built on family lines. And in my last video, we were discussing the book of Jubilees, which does explain a lot of this as well as the Bible does, and in a different way and maybe a little more in depth. But even the Bible explains that, I think Japheth had 5 or 6 sons, and Ham had 4 sons, and Shem had, 4, 5, 6 sons. I don't remember the numbers exactly. It doesn't really matter. But they all had sons, they all had wives, they all had family, and those families expanded out over the earth after the flood. At least that's the story from the Bible. So how did we get to this place where we see 3 different lineages coming from 3 sons? If it was me, I'll put up another image here, but if it was me, and this is, I think, from the, but if it was me and I put up an image, now whether you think that they were all white children, that's fine, or if you think they were all Middle Eastern looking, or if they're all African or Chinese or whatever, it doesn't really matter. But the issue is they came from the same family. So we would expect the same characteristics of that family, not just by looks and race, which we talk about, but what kind of food they made, what kind of jokes they told, where they were. They were a family, just like any family in our day. And unless you have adopted children, generally the children look like the parents. Yes, there's variations, of course there are, and always are. But that is the sort of the genetic pool they've come from, so that's kind of what they look like. And as I said, you've never seen, at least I've never seen, and living here in Mexico, I've never gone around to a Mexican family and go, oh, you've got 3 children. One looks Chinese, the other looks like he's from Norway, and the other one looks like he's from Africa. That is amazing. How did that happen? The only logical way would be if someone was fooling around in the family. The mother was, but that's beside the point. So when we take these things for granted, Babylon over time feeds us an image. It feeds us, it's church and state linked. They have their systems, they have their reasons, we'll get into some of that as we go through this. But I want to talk about Rome. I want to talk about even into, the pointy hat guys and the German group there, 100 years ago almost, and what happened with race and where did it go and how did that happen that we got to these pictures that we just accept. Most of you that watch my videos know that your Genesis pretty well, and it gives genealogies, it gives families, it gives tribes, it gives clans, it gives peoples. Even when you're reading later on at the time of King David and on down, it's still peoples. They may not all be of the 12 tribes, but the people around, even the Babylonian and the Syrian, and that doesn't matter which group it is, they don't give them as racially based peoples. They give them as genealogical based people. So some of the people that even attacked the 12 tribes may have been from Ham and others from Shem. I'm not sure about Japheth, I don't think so. But as these peoples and nations spread out over hundreds and millennia, they took up more space, they became more peoples, and that type of thing. But when we just think of your Bible, think, where does it talk about race? It really doesn't. Some people in our day, especially among the Hebrew Israelite group, they really go on about the Esau thing, which one of my past videos, on my last video, I think, or the one before, somebody chastised me for being Esau, right? And I'm going like, no, I'm a Gentile. My family, it's like, I'm sure my family's from Japheth, I'm sure, and maybe I do have a little bit of the other tribes mixed in there over the generations. But the issue is Esau was African, right? Because Jacob was African, as I've shown in my other videos. So Esau was African, right? Esau, it's a big mistake. But that's where we are in our world today. Everything is based on race. And I'm going like, it's like thinking that every black person in the whole world is from the 12 tribes. Well, that's not logical either, because what about Ham? What about Shem? Even Japheth? I mean, if they came from that heritage, then really everybody's brothers and sisters. And I know people get into all kinds of other crazy stuff I don't want to get into here about fallen angels and that kind of thing. I just want to deal with just what the text says in the Bible, and a little bit of Jubilees, because Jubilees is very good at clarifying a few points. So just remember the 12 tribes that were chosen because of Jacob. They didn't look any different than the rest of the Shemites. It wasn't by looks. Abraham wasn't chosen for his looks. I'm sure he was okay looking because his wife was beautiful, so I'm sure he was good looking. But that's not why he was chosen. He wasn't chosen because he was from some race. He was chosen because of his heart, his obedience and his heart. That's why he was chosen. Okay? And then that covenant passed down through his family. But the other Shemites, okay, and also Moab and Ammon and all the different groups, the Ammonites and they're all different shades of this and that. But that isn't how the Bible, like I said, is divided. It's divided by a covenant people and the non-covenant people. And the covenant people are who wrote pretty much all the Bible is from the covenant people. And the non-covenant people, or the Gentile nations, were all the rest, right? It's everybody else that weren't in the covenant. But I want to mention this right here. Isaiah specifically says that the 12 tribes, their role was to be a light to the Gentiles, mean a light to the world. Where they got off base all the time was they fell into pride and all those other things and thought they were, think about Jesus when he reprimanded the people in Nazareth and the Pharisees. They thought, and John the Baptist did the same thing, they thought just because they were of Abraham or of the covenant lineage that they were better or superior to others. And I disagree. They were superior in the sense that they've been given a duty, a role, a covenant to lift up all the other nations, everyone else. That is what it means in Isaiah, in my opinion, to be a light to all nations. So I asked chat what the Romans thought about this issue, and it said Romans would not think in terms of modern race categories. So that picture that I've been showing at the beginning of Ham, Japheth, and Shem, they would have gone like, well, what the heck is that? Right? That's not how they saw the world. Doesn't mean there weren't different races by that time. Of course there were, right? But that is not how their world was defined by race as it is today, more or less. It's not as bad as it used to be, but it's still not. It was defined by citizenship, Roman versus non-Roman, as we see with Paul in the Gospels, or Jesus. Ethnicity, so people and groups, the Gauls, the Greeks, the Egyptians, but it wasn't by skin color, right? It was by groups where they came from. So the Gauls, of course, where Germany is, and that up in France and up that area, right? Or the Britons or the Africans or whatever. Also by language and culture and legal status, whether you're a slave or not. And Chad said they were not blind to appearances, okay? They described different peoples as lighter, darker, taller, etc. That was fine. And they associated geography with some physical traits. But these observations, this is Chat speaking, were descriptive, not systematically biological, okay? They weren't race-based. They were descriptive. They were not organized into a fixed global race theory and not used as a single universal classification system for all humanity. And I'm not making that the Romans were good, right? It's just say the Romans were the Romans, that's fine. But the issue is they did not see as we see. If they looked at, as I said, with that image, they wouldn't see it that way. That's not how they defined their world. There's a great example where Paul is accosted, in his travels, and one of them says, "Are you an Egyptian?" Right? Because he's black, right? I assume, right? And one of the guys says, "Are you sure you're a Roman? Because you look like an Egyptian, right?" Well, we know what Egyptians looked like, so he looked Egyptian. Paul looked Egyptian, big deal, right? But he didn't look Roman to this fellow, right? For what would be Italian Roman. But Roman citizenry came from all over the world. Wherever they conquered, people could, through different ways and means, end up becoming a Roman citizen. So the next period of time I want to look at is about 500 CE or AD or whatever you want to call it. And it says, this is Chad again, early Jewish and Christian writers mostly read genealogies as lists of peoples and nations, explanations of geography and ancestry, not biological race systems. So let's look next at the late antiquity or medieval period, so from 500 to 1400 CE or AD. During this time, it says some Christian and Jewish commentators began to associate certain descendants with known regions like Europe, Asia, Africa, but still mainly in geographical or cultural terms, not strict racial biology. So it was just this is barely starting at that time. The next period is the early modern period. Okay, so the 1500s to the 1700s. This is when the Christian Reformation is happening. This is the start of the colonial period of coming to Americas and all over the world, that type of thing, the colonial power. That's just the start of it, okay? And this is where it says this is where things begin to shift more sharply. As Europeans expanded globally, thinkers started to try to organize human diversity systematically, and Genesis genealogies were used as a framework to explain world populations. And to me, this is a fascinating time because if you look back at even the writings of the early explorers, that type of thing, it's not so much racially based. They mention the first natives, let's say, that they found in Americas. They mention them as being African looking. They mention them as copper colored. They mention them different shades and variations. It wasn't like there was one uniform group, but there were definitely African, what you want to call them, African American looking people in the Americas when Columbus and all the rest got here. They were already here. Yes, did some come from Africa? Yes, but there were already people here who were the native Indians, who then became reclassified as mulatto, and then reclassified as colored, and then reclassified until finally they're African Americans when they're going. And I watched some great videos. I'll try to post a couple links on the below here in the description. But there are great channels in the U.S. from people would call black Americans or African Americans, and they're going through their family history and they're going like, I'm back into the 16, 1700s, and there are no slaves from Africa in my genealogy, or if there is, there's one. The rest are all native Indians. Then they realize what tribe that they probably came from and that kind of thing. And that's fine, be that as it may. But this reclassification really started to happen as we move into from 1700 up to 1900. So the 18th and 19th centuries, and Chad agreed, said that this was the key turning point, and I agree. This is where these images that I showed you at the beginning, I'll show you a few more here, that's where these images really started to gain, not the images themselves, but the idea that Ham is black and only black, and Japheth is white and only white, and Shem is in the middle and he is something else. And I'm going to do another video, I'm working on it as well, on where Shem actually, where I believe it actually, his land was. And I think that'll be I hope it'll be a good video. But anyway, but be that as it may, the issue is, by this time, this is in the full movement of slave time. This is in the full stripping Africa of its wealth and the Americas. So we're fully into the colonial period. And the conquering Europeans needed, or felt they needed, a reason to put themselves, I suppose, on top. And this is where the white person, the white, becomes the top. Whereas if you go back to the time of Rome and back before that, it wasn't the whites. The whites, if you go research this, in Europe, they were backwards, super backwards. Even when Rome conquered Gaul and those areas, they were conquering uncivilized peoples as they saw them, right? The Mediterranean was more civilized in a sense than Gaul and up into France and all up into Britain and all that area. But be that as may, as the Europeans grew and as their power grew, especially because of the shipping and that kind of thing, then the Gentile nations rose to the fore over the darker races, let's call it that way. But if you look back at Egypt, the time of Egypt, or look to China, or look to the Mesopotamia area, or even into Africa, anywhere, you'll see civilization long before you see it in Europe. But things switched, and that's fine, that's where we are. But they had a reason. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, human populations were classified into races. This is where race theory started to get its shape. And those races were often mapped onto biblical figures, just like I showed in these pictures. Shem became Semitic or Asiatic, Ham, African, and Japheth, European. And I'll show here one video that says, about Ham, right? Ham is always the one that people spurn Ham. And I'm going like, why? Ham, and I did a video on this. Ham wasn't cursed, right? I'm sorry. Canaan was cursed. And I did a video on that. I'll put a link in the video for that. But Canaan, the son of Ham, was cursed, yes. The Bible doesn't say so, but Jubilees is pretty accurate, I think. At least that's my opinion on what it is. But the issue is, it never says that Ham is cursed. Yet, 18th and 19th century people believe that Ham is cursed. Many religions believe that Ham was cursed, and yet the Bible does not say that at all. And it doesn't say in the Bible that Japheth was white and Ham was black and that Shem was in the middle. It just says they were a family. It just said they had 3 wives. And I'll put a picture here. There's people now thinking, oh, the wives were, one was black, one was Asian, one was white. Because we want to place what we think now, after thousands of years, back on something. But they were a family. And if we can get anything out of this video, I hope you can get out of the idea that those 3 brothers were family. They would have looked, in my opinion, very much alike. I'll show an image here that someone else used in a video, and I think that's fairly accurate. They would probably looked fairly alike, right? You would recognize them. You would say, if you saw them, and you'd say, yep, they're Chinese, or they're African, or they're from here, or they're from there. You just by their features, overall features, you'd say, yeah, I think they're probably from there. You wouldn't look at that family and go, oh, look, one is white, one is middle, and one is black from Africa. It just, this came from the 18th and 19th century thinking, and it had to do a lot with colonial powers, in my opinion, and this need to, if you want to degrade people so you can then take their land and their resources. But this is where the strong racialization of the Table of Nations becomes common. Whereas before there was just the Table of Nations, yes, but they knew there were some differences, but this is where it becomes really formalized. And it was influenced by, as I said, colonial ideology, early physical anthropology, and attempts to harmonize the Bible with the global exploration. And now in modern times, just quickly, I want to mention this, it shows genetics, shows human variation is not divided into these simple biblical branches, like boom, 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 3 branches. Historians treat the Table of Nations as ancient ethnographic, geographic schema, or a way, or not biology. They treat it now as just, as an older idea of how things happened. But the bottom line is that racial mapping shown in these images of Shem, Japheth, and Ham, and I know it's going to be hard to get as if I asked almost anyone I went around and said, where is Ham from? People are just going to go Africa. And if I said, where's Shem from? They'll go the Middle East. Well, maybe Shem was from Africa too. Who knows? But we just have it built into our minds because of what we've been taught. And that's what I mean about this fleeing Babylon. In order to truly, in my opinion, understand the Bible, we have to realize that our fathers, as it says in the scriptures, taught us lies. Not intentionally, but traditions of men have come through. Just as in Jesus' day, he dealt with the Pharisees and the traditions of men. They are strong. It's what people believe. It's why they got furious in Nazareth and wanted to throw Jesus off a cliff when he said that God had favored a couple of Gentiles. They couldn't deal with that because of their traditions. What he was saying was not untrue, but they couldn't deal with it. And we can't deal with it. And it's very hard to change our minds. So fleeing Babylon and all the things we've been taught is very, very difficult. So these images are not ancient, they're not biblical in origin, and they're mainly solidified in the 18th and 19th century. I had asked Chat, I hope you'll find this interesting. I asked Chat, I see overlay between the colonial need to conquer land and subjugate people and the coming of this, racial system. And it said, yes, the timing overlap is real. The major period of European colonial expansion, roughly from 1500 to 1900, includes colonization of the Americas, the Atlantic slave trade, the expansion into Africa and Asia, and development of global European empires. And during this same period, European thinkers were actively building early systems of human classification. And that is when racial mapping of Genesis, linking Shem to Asia, Ham to Africa, and Japheth to Europe, that's where it became widely known and then accepted everywhere. As promised at the beginning of the video, I want to deal with the guy with the little mustache and his group back in Europe, almost 100 years ago. And where did that come from? Because to me, I asked Chad, I said, I have to say, I said to Chad, would you say that the little guy with his little mustache and his beliefs on race came out of this broad European thing we've been discussing? And it said, broadly, there is a historical connection in terms of intellectual inheritance, but it's not a simple came from X directly line, and Chat usually does that anyway. But it did draw from European racial theories from the 18th and 19th centuries, social Darwinism, the misuse of evolutionary ideas, the colonial era hierarchies, racial hierarchies, as we just discussed, some earlier biblical ethnological frameworks. So that's kind of where he and that group came from with their ideas. And they haven't gone away. They're still over there, very strong, just as strong as they were 100 years ago, in my opinion. So then I asked about the other group, the one with the 3 letters from the US with their little pointy hats. And I said, is that a common background as well? And it said, yes, in broad historical sense, that's largely correct, with some nuance, of course. They have the shared background, same as the other fellow. So the groups like this developed in the world, shaped by 18th and 19th century race theories, humans divided by race, colonial era hierarchies, pseudo-scientific anthropology, and older cultural ideas about lineage and peoples coming from the Bible, but through the lens of what we've been talking about today, through the lens of race that was brought in by the Europeans, basically. And so these groups, as we may find them distasteful, they came assuredly from the same system, the same belief system. I mean, I grew up with the same belief system myself. Not that I felt I ever was racist, but I accepted those pictures of Ham, Shem, and Japheth and never thought about it, never gave it a moment's thought. Not that I was putting anyone down, but I just, that was, but once I started to look at it, and as I've been analyzing where the Bible probably took place, and I'll link it at the end of the video, I'll put a link there, but once I started looking at these things, I'm going like, well, that doesn't make sense, and that doesn't make sense, and that doesn't make sense. And then you realize, I think almost everything that I ever was taught, biblically or almost anywhere else, is riddled with problems, let's put it that way. I mentioned this, but I want to cover this a little bit more. As I said, and I'm going to leave a few links at the bottom, there are great African-American channels out there that are dealing with these issues. Kurameo Awahu, I think his name is, he does great videos. And there's a American Re-Education or something, but I'll put some links there. But they are, a lot of African Americans are realizing that they're not really African Americans per se. Maybe thousands of years ago they came from Africa, but they realized that when the colonial powers came here, their ancestors were already here. They weren't brought by ship. Doesn't mean that there weren't people brought here by ship. Of course there were people brought by ship, we know that too. But the majority of the people, as they do their family history, they find maybe 1 in 16 of their ancestors is from Africa and the rest of them are native Indians. And when we read the explorers, I'm going to do a video on this. And like I said, if you really want to look into that, there's a great channel. Kurameo has a great channel. But the early explorers, if you read what they actually said, 400 or 500 years ago, you'll see that the people that they found here were not, the Blackfoot of the Dakotas or something. That's not who they found in the eastern and southern U.S. and in the islands. They said they looked Ethiopian. They looked African. They were dark-skinned with curly hair and wore feathers and that kind of thing. They didn't look like what we picture. But over time, how many Indian reservations are there really in the U.S., in the eastern U.S., from the Mississippi eastward? There's all very, very few. There are some, but they're very, very few. And again, if you look at the people that are in those bands that are still there, I mean, you would think these Native Americans are actually African American. If you look at them, you go, what are you guys playing at? Because our mind, again, has been given this colonial perception that all the native Indians from the western part of the U.S. that we see today that have been, intermarried and everything, but we see that that's what the Native Americans are. But the real Native Americans, that were the bulk of the Native Americans, went into slavery. They went into difficult times. So the name, if you look at the U.S. Census, it went, and that's what these people do. It's wonderful. I love watching their shows. They went from being classified as Indian, back in the 1700s. We're talking about the same person or even the same family. They went from being Indian to either mulatto or colored, to Negro or black, to now African American. It's like, but it's the same person. If the same person over 100 years goes through three or four censuses, and they keep switching what they really are. They start out Indian and they end up black, right? And nothing has changed in that individual. They're still the same person, but they've been classified by the government to be different because as things changed, we needed their land. So we needed to move them out and reclassify them. It also moved into religion, especially with Brigham Young. After Joseph Smith and the Mormon faith, black people were full partnership in the church. And he ran to be president, actually, to free the slaves. It was part of his platform, but he was killed. So when Brigham Young took over, he made the church at that time completely race-based, to where he banned the same black men that had been part of Joseph Smith's leadership in the church. Brigham banned them and anyone else that was from what he considered Ham from the gospel. Anyway, he banned them, right? And it was taken off in 1978. Now the church says that was wrong. But the issue is that same thing came from the same place as the pointy hats and the little guy. It came from that thinking. Maybe it manifested a little stronger in that church, but that wasn't the only church. If you look at every white church pretty much in the U.S., or every European-based church in the U.S. back in the 1700s, 1800s, they weren't, mixed black and white people going to the same church. There was that racial undertone was already getting firmly ingrained. I want to say that as we go back through these things ourselves, I don't think we have to go to hatred or believing one thing or another. I think we just have to look at the facts, look at logic. And when I looked at that picture, I'm going like, that's not even logical, not even. And yet people are putting out all kinds of videos on YouTube, and they use that picture with thinking nothing of it. And yet, logically, when I look at it now, I'm going like, as I was searching for pictures on this, I'm going like, logically, that makes 0 sense. It's not logical. And I like logic. I don't know if what they looked like, of course, Shem, and Japheth. All I know is they were a family, and they probably looked, as they were brothers, they probably looked alike in most ways. Anyway, I did a video on Babel. Instead of looking at it where most people place it in the Mesopotamia, putting it possibly in Ethiopia. Take a look at that. And I did one on Moses here. I did one on Moses leading the people through the Nile into North Africa and down into Africa. Hope you enjoy it. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks and have a good day. Take care. Bye-bye.